So on behalf of my colleagues in the Africa and Events programs at IPI, the International Peace Institute, I would like to really welcome all of you to this really interesting discussion this afternoon called Building Peace and Development in the Sahel and Maghreb, Enhancing the Political Participation of Women and Youth. And you'll see that we have sort of put the Sahel and Maghreb together because they both interact with each other in a very profound way. This is actually the fifth meeting that we've held in 3 years on the Sahel and the Maghreb, including meetings that we have held in Rabat, in Tunis, and Niamey, as well as 2 meetings in this room where we have been trying to track the developments in the Sahel, and particularly the issues of governance and the role of women and the role of civil society in trying to have an impact on changing the policies in these particular countries in the Sahel and the Maghreb, and having a voice in bringing about, constructive change in the region. So we're going to focus on 2 main issues today, namely strengthening governance. This, in our mind at IPI, good governance is the key to the future, to a better future. And poor governance, non-governance, bad governance is at the heart of so many of these problems of poverty, underdevelopment, violence, terrorism, gun running, smuggling, etc. So we're going to focus here on strengthening governance and the roles that civil society groups can play in seeking to address the underlying and really complex security issues and the severe socioeconomic problems in the region. So we're going to first, after I stop my brief remarks here, we'll have an overview by my colleague Youssef Mahmoud on the contents of the Rabat seminar, which was held in June of this year, and he's going to make that presentation together with Professor Bushra Benhida, and I'd like to welcome you very much because Professor Benhida has come here from Morocco to share her insights and perspective with us. We're then going to have, and the reason we're doing this way, is we're going to have a presentation by my former colleague, still colleague in my mind, Mireille Afaminzi, now with UN Women, on the research project that Priscilla Inza-Benita and she carried out earlier this year in Senegal, Niger, and Mali. So she's going to offer a PowerPoint. So that's why we're going to do this setup. Afterwards, we will come back and sit down up there. And then we're going to have a summary from Ms. Katerina Limonopoulou, close, from the Department of Political Affairs on the integrated strategy of the United Nations in seeking to address the very same issues that we're talking about. After all that, we're going to have a Q&A. So again, I'm very pleased to have you all here. I really thank the panel. It's a terrific panel for sharing their insights with us today. And I'm going to turn the floor over first to Youssef Mahmoud, my terrific colleague here. Youssef.
Hello, everyone. I've organized my brief intervention under 3 main headings. One is what is so unique about the Rabat meeting, the main objectives, and then I will share with you some of the insights that I gained from the elders that have participated, because I happen to have chaired that particular segment of the program in Rabat. People didn't have to look very far and wide, and knowing how sparse my head is and how little my hat, when I put it on, sits very uncomfortably, so they will be dealing with the elders. So I was delighted to facilitate the discussion with the elders. I'll just share with you 2 or 3 things. And then finally, the main conclusions of the overall conclusions of the Rabat meeting, which, as John said, is a series of events dealing with the Sahel. So why devote a meeting to civil society? And it's basically the women, the youth, the elders, and the private sector, or the entrepreneurs. Because in our view, most or many of the developments in the areas of peace, security, and development in the Sahel region and in the Maghreb, for that matter, are being driven from below. In fact, if you look very closely, particularly in the areas of peace and security, the agenda is being set by non-state actors. The governments are simply reacting. So that's one reason. Second is that why there is a recognition of involving the private sector, involving civil society in general, there hasn't really been a forum specifically designed to give these various non-state actors a forum that will enable them to analyze the problems and provide their own perspective of what the solution should be. So they were not there as speakers. They were the experts and the policymakers. So we felt that a specific forum that will give them that platform would be important, so they are not sitting there listening to others describing the problems and prescribing the solution, when in fact they are constantly at the receiving end and not being enough involved in the analysis and the decision. And I think finally we felt that because we were of the view that most of the problems that afflict the Sahel and the Maghreb are transnational in origin and effect, it is important to hear how these civil society groups interact, and both the non-state actors that are drivers and sustainers of conflict, as well as those who really work for better governance and development. And as you can imagine, at that time when we designed it almost a year ago, Libya facilitated that connection for good or for bad. Unfortunately, mostly for bad, not good. So because it brought these non-state actors with all other kinds of transnational actors whose motivations are not always benign. So we've invited representatives from women, youth, the private sector, and the elders from 5 countries in the North Africa and 5 countries in the Sahel. So we had about 30 participants participating in this meeting. And we had a fora for each of this group. And Mireille, Professor Bushra, myself, and other colleagues, we just facilitated that conversation, but they were driving it. So it was a kind of sub-regional meeting, bringing these 2 sub-regions together, the North African, and it was really mostly organized by local think tanks. So Dr. Bushra was the head of one and representing the University of Hassan Premier in Rabat, and there was a strategic think tank called AMI, and there was a think tank from Mauritania called Center for S, and IPI was just one of the partners to facilitate that discussion. So really, both the organization and the substance is locally driven. So there were a number of perspectives, as you can imagine. I was privileged to sort of facilitate the discussion among the elders. My colleagues will speak about the perspective of other stakeholders from civil societies. But the elders were of the view that the quality of participation leaves a lot to be desired. Even though there is a sort of a recognition that this is a century of participation, unfortunately, there are more tales of marginalization than participation. And they felt they were the first victim of that. And they have shared a lot of evidences and how they used their mediation capacities and their traditional values and their status in the various societies to promote peace, citizenship, and taking advantage of modernity. You'd be surprised what these elders do with cell phones. And they felt that there was not enough inclusion. So they feel, and they gave all kinds of examples of their roles in helping with various rebel movement, Tuareg rebellions. And one of them was mentioning that some countries in the Sahel have realized that this heritage is likely to be lost if the government didn't do something. So there was an elder from Burkina Faso who said that the government has created a fora to bring together traditional leaderships and young people to transmit some of the knowledge and skills and wisdom that they felt was being depleted because of lack of use. IPI will be publishing shortly a report that basically summarize many of these insights, and I'm sure that you will be informed once it is out, and you will see there are many more nuggets of wisdom as they, and so for them, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of understanding what's going on, but they feel they have a unique perspective to add history and wisdom. So the seminar, this workshop ended up with a number of conclusions. I'm going to just mention 2 or 3. And my colleagues, you will see, will deepen when they brief you on a specific segment. One of the things that came very clear from the Rabat seminar is we have to rethink of what we mean by nation state. And that we have, in that redefinition and rethinking, we have to make room for citizenship. Citizenship as a framework for enhancing participation. And therefore, there is a push for more and more citizen-oriented governance, where citizens are not simply consulted during elections, but consultation and involvement participation is a constant process. Because they have sort of made it very clear, particularly the young people, that citizens in general are no longer content with the proposition that their ability to change government must wait for the next elections. Or wait for some, I'm sure you've been following what had happened in Senegal, and you've been following recently what has happened and is happening still as we speak in Burkina Faso. It's citizen-led movements, and some of them encourage us to avoid the word NGOs and civil society because it doesn't no longer represent or reflect the way citizens are organizing themselves to affect change. So that's one, thinking the role of nation state and how citizen and citizen participation can be envisioned. Second, there is a need for governments and other stakeholders to create forums and platforms for exchanging for sensitizing women, youth, particularly to analyze these new transnational threats that seem to be driving and sustaining conflict in the Sahel. They feel there is not enough safe and structured spaces for people to voice their views and propose analyses. And particularly the focus on women, that investment in women is investment in society, in the family, and particularly if governments would wish to address the underlying reasons for radicalism, well, women and the family is a starting point. But if they have not been given a platform for providing that insight and analysis, then it will be still a state-centered, interstate-centered approaches to this problem when most of these issues are driven by non-state actors, some of them with state aspirations in terms of controlling territory, having taxes that they collect, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of discussions about reviving and reinterpreting and re-energizing the Women in Peace and Security agenda from the point of view of 1325, but not least, and my colleague, Dr. Bushra, will speak about that, and I'll stop here, is unleashing the entrepreneurial potential of women and youth was repeated regularly. Because entrepreneurship can create economic incentives for peace. And the idea is that if you have something in common, you are likely to be aware that if there is war and tension, all of you will be losers. And so they felt one way is to, because you cannot expect everything from the state, that's another reason, and therefore there has to be an encouragement of unleashing particularly the female entrepreneurship potential. So I'll stop here, John, and then we can defeat. Thank you.
I think I can start by saying that I will be definitely speaking as a former IPI researcher and not in my new capacity. And I'm presenting the outcome of the research that my colleague Priscilla, I can't see her in the room. Ah, okay, there she is. And we conducted in Mali, Niger, and Senegal. It was in May this year. And in 2014, one of IPI's, I think Ambassador Hirsch also mentioned it earlier, one of IPI's research priorities was to explore the risk and opportunities governance presents to peace, stability, and development in sub-Saharan Africa. Where do I click? But we tried it, like yeah. So something happened. Oh, you will move the slides. How will you know? Okay. So we convened, please. We convened various meetings. Oh, okay. So do I just go?
You tested it.
Yes, it was working right now.
You do it manually, Tom.
I'm trying, yeah. There we go.
Okay. No, this is the Zoom. Do we need tone? Yeah.
There we go.
No.
No, that's you can also push the arrow buttons.
I'm trying. Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
We convened. Okay, please.
I got it.
We convened various meetings and conducted research on governance challenges, lessons learned, and the way forward in Mali, in the Central African Republic, in South Sudan, among other countries. We also conducted field research in 3 countries in the Sahel, Mali, Niger, and Senegal, to hear from specific segments of the society and see how women and youth perceive and experience challenges of governance, and also to identify ways in which the resilience opportunities of these groups can be enhanced and their marginalization reduced. 3 main challenges were identified to women and youth political participation. The main one is the growing distrust between the political elite, predominantly male and older, and the citizens. And this distrust results from factors such as the monopoly of political power, the non-respect of electoral promises, corruption, and also the fact that some women and youth have often been co-opted for token participation. Secondly, socioeconomic challenges prevent meaningful participation of women and youth, and these cover factors such as the widespread poverty and economic marginalization of women, high illiteracy rates, especially of girls, and youth unemployment. And thirdly, we observe the increasing presence of conservative religious leaders who have an influence on lawmakers and whose interpretation of the Sharia law often prevents or limits women's public participation. In the 3 countries that we visited, we also saw that a number of responses are being developed to overcome these challenges. Concerning women, these responses touched on the national gender frameworks and strategies that are being developed or have been developed. Senegal and Niger each have adopted a national gender policy in 2008, and Mali adopted one in 2010. We can also mention the fact that Senegal has adopted a national action plan for the implementation of Resolution 1325. In Senegal, women have also mobilized and lobbied for the adoption of a parity law in 2010, which increased their representation in parliament from 18 to 43%. In Niger, when we were there, it was right after the National Women's Day, which is an occasion that provides, an event that provides women opportunities to raise their issues. And this year, they were really focused on inclusive leadership, or like strengthening their leadership, their political participation, also entrepreneurship, Mr. Mahmoud mentioned it, and their involvement in peace initiatives. During this year and the celebration of this Women's Day, women in Niger also tried to lobby the government to increase the gender quota law that was adopted since 2000, but like a 10% quota, to increase it to a 30% quota. And it was interesting to hear that the president, the government, agreed to look into increasing the quota, but only after the next presidential elections, and it's in early 2016. In Senegal and Mali, women have established election monitoring platforms to prevent electoral fraud and conflict during the elections, respectively in 2012 and 2013. In Senegal, the election monitoring platform rolled out what they call the 3M strategy, focusing on mobilization, mediation, and monitoring. And they really claim that, yes, it helped appeasing tensions during the electoral period. Local responses are also being developed by youth. In Senegal, for example, we know the Yanama movement, which used music and poetry to mobilize youth against former President Abdoulaye Wade's attempts to run for a 3rd term in 2012 and encourage youth to go out in mass and vote. In Niger, youth are part of civil society training programs that seek to increase citizen participation in budget preparation at community level and in monitoring the implementation of these budgets. And here, it's a placer les droits humains au cœur du budget de l'État, putting human rights at the heart of the state budget. While development approaches have often been state-centric and top-down with the hope that they will trickle down, local initiatives help to promote people-centered governance. To continue building resilience and mitigate the risk posed by exclusive and unaccountable governance, the field research highlighted a number of recommendations which can benefit from further regional and international support. The first recommendation touched on norm implementation and strengthening institutions. Greater efforts and innovative strategies should be developed to bridge the gap that exist between national and international laws, policies, and programs, and their actual implementation on the ground. Like we all heard in the three countries how like the laws are very nice, very beautiful, but the reality is completely or totally something else. Additional efforts should also seek to strengthen the national mechanisms that have been established to promote good governance, gender equality, and youth participation by providing these structures, mechanisms with adequate resources, autonomy, and clear mandates. Efforts should also seek to increase access to social services with a big focus on education, especially for girls, healthcare services, also to facilitate citizen education programs, and which are mostly conducted by civil society organizations, and to ensure that education and training that is provided to the youth actually match the demands of the employment market. We saw that a number of youth have sometimes gone to university but are not able to find a job and employment other than maybe a taxi driver, cab driver, or carpenter. We met a young who had been in Bamako, who had been to university. I think he had a license either in law or political sciences, but he was helping in his uncle's carpenter workshop. So I think these are some of the issues that we were able to hear from. Capacity building initiatives, including by sharing experiences across countries and regions, should also be encouraged or pursued to facilitate meaningful participation of women and youth and increase the effectiveness of elected women and youth to defend their constituencies, priorities, and concerns. Again, we heard so many women talking about the fact that some of the women who had been elected into parliament didn't actually know why they were there, and like their capacity still needs to be reinforced or strengthened for them to contribute meaningfully. Bridges should be established between young political leaders and youth from other groups, including civil society, and from traditionally marginalized groups, such as young women, uneducated youth from rural areas, to build alliances and broaden support. Here we had a meeting with a group, I think 25 young political leaders in Mali, and among the 25 political leaders, there was only one young woman. And they actually didn't realize, they were talking about the fact that they were being marginalized by the older males, but they didn't realize that young women were not part of that group, or they didn't realize that they were all like urban, educated, young political leaders, and all the others were out, the ones that are like sellers at the markets or from rural areas. Finally, sensitization programs and inclusive dialogue processes should continue to address or involve all actors concerned, including progressive clerics, who can support advocacy campaigns by explaining the Sharia law and expressing their support for women's public participation. I think this one is quite clear. Thank you.
So we've already heard the linkages between the themes that were developed at the workshop in Rabat from Youssef Mahmoud and the research that Priscilla and Mireille carried out in Mali, Niger, and Senegal. So now we're going to have an opportunity to hear directly from Professor Benhida, who's the geopolitics expert, the director of the Executive Education Center at Al Aqwayan University in Morocco, and most importantly, for our purposes, the co-project director with Youssef on strengthening the role of women and civil society groups in participation. So, Professor Benhida, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Excellency. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm deeply honored to take part of this forum that is engaged and committed to debate new ideas to reach real democracy and stability in the areas of Sahel and Maghreb. Today, I'm going to present you with 3 propositions, suggestions, that are a product of our meeting in Rabat. As you all know, the frequent conflicts that our region, I mean Maghreb and Sahel, is faced with are continuously hampering the ongoing development of areas. Of these areas, I mean Maghreb and Sahel. These conflicts are exacerbated by economic underdevelopment, by youth unemployment, and by the inability of states to ensure the safety, regulatory functions of its citizens. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to emphasize that poverty is not always the only catalyst to these conflicts. It's not simply a matter of income or inflation. Being poor does not automatically mean being a rebel or a terrorist. However, when deprived of basic life necessities, terrorism and other forms of violence are not far behind. UNDP and other agencies of local and international development have concluded that the inequality and social discrimination are the two main reasons that drives people to make the decision to carry a weapon. A simple access to basic human elements for living, for instance, potable water, electricity, education, and employment, in one word, providing dignity and hope to citizens of this part of the world, and I mean Maghreb and Sahel, would reduce factors of instability and violence. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share with you some ideas we have developed in Rabat meeting. Our propositions are related to three main actors: private sector, entrepreneurship, and civil society. Firstly, private sector. Companies have much to offer to help eradicate poverty and bring dignity and hope in Sahel and Maghreb. Examples of solutions offered are: companies can adopt and or subsidize affordable pricing policies via social innovation. 2, companies can work with government and international organizations to enhance democracy and reduce bureaucracy and corruption. 3, companies can set up an all-inclusive strategy. In this way, companies will create economic incentives for peace in a world in general and particularly in this region. The second actor on the scene are entrepreneurs, especially in small and medium businesses. These kind of businesses are major engines of growth in the countries in transition. It creates jobs, alleviates poverty, develops economy, and thus lead to political stability. These two first propositions, companies' involvement and entrepreneurship support, are essential and must be a part of a bottom-up strategy, which in turn leads me to the third and equally important propositions, or actor, if you will, the civil society. In our last meeting in Rabat, we have created the GC33. Rest assured, the GC33 is certainly not a new strand of the flu virus, okay? GC33 is an independent group of diversified citizens, men, women, youth, wise men, entrepreneurs from the 5 countries of Sahel and the 5 countries of Maghreb. The GC33 is the first idea group of its kind that emerged from our deliberations in Rabat. It represents a new approach via a virtual forum. Its purpose is to produce and exchange ideas, solutions from within about Sahel and Maghreb issues. These solutions are visionary in the sense that they are the product of citizens and not an executive board. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the bottom-up strategy. In summary, we introduce to you today 3 innovative ideas around companies, entrepreneurs, and the GC33. At the end, stability can only be achieved through integration of economic and solutions, and citizen participation. Allow me to conclude with this quotation. My notion of democracy is that under it, the weakest should have the same opportunity as the strongest. This can never happen except through non-violence. Mahatma Gandhi, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, all these presentations so far are a very compressed synthesis of these rather substantive meetings and this very substantive research project that was carried out. So in the meantime, and in parallel, the United Nations has been adopting and working on an integrated strategy for the Sahel, dealing with many of the same issues. And we're now going to hear from Katerina Limopoulou, who's a political affairs officer in Africa 2 and DPA, who's been working on and is going to synthesize for us some of the recommendations emerging from the integrated strategy. So, Katerina, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hirsch, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. As Professor Benhida pointed out, despite the collective efforts of the countries of the region and the international community across the Sahel region, there continues to be conflict, political crisis, terrorist and criminal activity, humanitarian crisis, and humanitarian vulnerability. Meanwhile, high levels of youth unemployment combined with limited capacity in many authorities in the Sahel region to deliver basic services and address the sense of economic and political marginalization felt by many groups of the population, as brought by the examples of Dr. Minzer presented in Mali, Niger, and Senegal, continue to increase the appeal of violent ideology. For many analysts, this is at the heart of the root causes of instability in the Sahel region. And this situation calls for stronger commitment by the governments in the region to not just improve governance, but strengthen the bond between the state and groups of the population which have previously felt marginalized and left out politically and economically. From what we've heard today, in doing so, the governments of the region do not start from scratch. On the contrary, it has pointed out at the regional seminar in Rabat that they should benefit greatly from the wisdom of the elderly on ways of reducing the risk of conflict and radicalization of society. And
bring the microphone a little bit closer.
Sure.
Perhaps. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
trouble hearing.
I'm sorry. The forum in Burkina Faso, which was described by Dr. Mahmoud, is a very good example. As also explained by Dr. Midja and Professor Benhida, the governments of the region should also build on the entrepreneurship and ambition of young men and women across the Sahel region to create and innovate and help shape economic policies and political reforms. And the very good innovative GC33 initiative is another very good example that can help do that, and we need a lot more of that. Hopefully, the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel is another useful tool to help us get closer to these objectives. For those of you who are not familiar, the strategy includes ambitious objectives in three broad areas, and it aims to enhance governance, to strengthen national and regional security mechanisms, and to build long-term resilience. In his reports to the Security Council, the Secretary General has emphasized the need for reforms in electoral processes and justice systems across the Sahel region. And in her oral briefings to the Security Council, the Special Envoy for the Sahel has noted that at every level, the quality of governance is crucial to create an environment that reduces effectively the risk of conflict and radicalization of societies across the Sahel and the youth in particular. Now, all we need to do is turn our nice words into action. And through the implementation of the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, the Secretary General and his Special Envoy maintain the attention of the Security Council on the important priorities and efforts to enhance the political inclusion and access by marginalized groups, particularly women and youth, to state services. We're making efforts to improve the UN regional analytical capacity and the operational implementation capacity in the Sahel by placing equal weight in the 3 areas of the strategy: governance, security, and resilience. And we're hoping that this will better inform the deliberations of the Council and their decisions for the region. My personal lesson from today's discussion is that it is not about helping the marginalized, but also enabling the wise, the entrepreneurs, the creative and ambitious minds of the Sahel. And I'm hoping these and subsequent discussions will keep feeding into our analysis and to what we present to the Council and to the region. Thank you.
So what we've heard this afternoon in a very succinct way is not only a brief recapitulation of many of the well-known problems in the Maghreb and the Sahel, but a number of very concrete suggestions for what Professor Benhida has called a bottom-up strategy. In other words, not waiting for governments or the UN, with all respect, to sort of make decisions on a top-down basis, but to really give an opportunity for civil society organizations, for entrepreneurs, for companies, for individuals to start having much more of a voice. This is something we've been discussing for over a year here at IPI, how to narrow the gap, the disconnect between those in charge in all these countries and at the UN and the citizen, as Professor Benhida made very clear. So I'd like to open this for a discussion or ask you if you have any sort of specific questions, not speeches, please, that address how can this gap be narrowed? How can this disconnect be narrowed? What more can be done, in your view, to strengthen the capacity of those, the citizens, those who are the receiving end of almost everything these days, to really have more of a voice in the decisions over their own lives? So if you'd like to address a question or to the panel, make a very brief comment, that would be great. Okay, so then I'm going to refer back to the panel after 2 or 3 of you offer some thoughts. So the floor is open here to anything any of you might like to say, unless you're totally convinced. Yeah, Cora, could you each identify yourself, please? Stand up and identify yourself and your affiliation.
Oh, no.
Why not?
Thank you. I'm Cora Weiss from the Hague Appeal for Peace. So in your introduction, Mr. Mahmoud, you referenced, without explication, 1325. And I wondered if the rest of you, in your work, train, teach, brief women that there is an international law called Women, Peace, and Security, which requires governments to put women at every level of governance and at every decision-making, peacemaking table. Were you able to let the women know that they have this capacity? And were you able to, I don't know if you tried to bring your conclusions to the governments, but were you able to tell them that it's a law that women have to be included?
And an objective, a major objective. So Warren Hogue, and then I can't quite see, but the lady there in the 7th row.
Right. Warren Hogue of IPI. Mireille mentioned in her presentation a resistance from religious leaders, which prompts me to ask the question about men in these cultures. Is it possible to characterize their reaction as one of neglect, one of resistance, in some cases, hopefully one of cooperation? But I think part of the enhancing the political role of women has to do with convincing men in these cultures that that's a good thing. And I want to ask you if that's a good question, and how do you go about doing that?
And that's great. And also, that relates to, Youssef, to your discussion with the elders, who I presume were men, maybe not completely, but are they conscious of the role of religious leaders, and what is their perception and their approach to dealing with, very, very conservative religious leaders as it impacts on the role of women and youth in these societies? So the lady there, please. Yeah, the lady right there. Yes, yes. Yes, right there next to Julie. Right there. There you are.
Thank you. My name is Yvonne Duarte.
You got to speak up.
I work with the UN, and my question is the following. You mentioned three fundamental actors, and I think the combination of these three actors could provide a powerful recipe, really, to break that negative cycle of security and falling back into conflict. And one of the sectors that you mentioned was private companies. And one of the proposals that you set out was to call on companies to invest and to provide economic incentives. The question is, how to trigger the appetite of companies to come into these areas of the world where they might naturally not want to come, and they might not find necessarily the environment, as they call it, the business climate, to come. How can that be triggered in the first place? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a very good question, because obviously there's competition to invest in Asia or to invest in Europe and so on. It's not as if Africa is the only ground for potential investment. So Judy Cheng Hopkins, please. Could you give her the microphone right up here? And then we're going to go back to the panel.
John, I made the mistake of recognizing a woman.
Well, we'll get to her afterward.
Hi to everybody. Judy Cheng Hopkins here, formerly of UN. This is great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think a lot of it actually substantiates, what we tend to have forgotten that was written in 2002, the so-called Arab Human Development Report, that points out the three deficits, if you remember: deficit of knowledge, deficit of freedoms, and deficit of women's empowerment. So your research and your conversations obviously substantiate very much the original conclusions of that Arab Human Development Report, which is great because obviously we have to be moving in that direction. But I want to ask you, though, because you work there on the ground, I want to ask you something a bit more uncomfortable, a little bit more insidious, if you wish. Which I'm noticing lately. I just came home. I just came back from Malaysia, my home, and I'm noticing something very worrying, which is in these so-called moderate countries, right? So now, we have the epicenter, if you wish, the Syrias and the Iraqs, and we have the periphery, the countries you deal with. Then I'm talking about the far periphery, the so-called moderate countries that are held out as examples, for moderate Islam and all that. But in these countries, I'm seeing something very worrying, which is that, because of what's going on globally, traditional old leaders, the strong men or women, strong men, are losing their grip on power. They're losing their grip. I'm talking about the Turkeys and the Malaysias. Sorry, I might get in trouble for this, but I don't think there's a Malaysian in here. Losing their grips on power. And, what is left? What is left is to go into this very Machiavellian type of politics, whereby you cater to the extreme right-wing fundamentalists, extreme right-wing. You cater to their fears, by throwing even more extreme thoughts, in order to win back this electorate. Because these countries, precisely because they're moderate and modern, they have quite a high number of educated individuals. So people are starting to turn away from these old leaders. But these old leaders need to engage that minority out there with this kind of radical talk. And that's why you have cases like, of Turkey, of Malaysia, even Tunisia, sending fighters to ISIS. And then there's even a story of giving them a hero's welcome when they come back dead. So I'm just wondering, in your observations, in your travels, in your work, how does one deal with this? Because it's really worrying. It's as old as Shakespeare, as old as Machiavelli, if you wish, but it's playing out in this very dangerous terrain now today that we have. and for very selfish reasons, contributing to something horrible.
So, a very good question. Again, what about the rise of radicalism and, not only the youth and vis-a-vis those in power, but even those in power vis-a-vis more radical groups, which is, I think, the point you just made. So we're going to go somewhere near to 2:45. I hope all of you will stay, unless you have an urgent meeting, to go somewhere else, so we can all participate together in this discussion. And we'll have a second round in just a few moments. So let's go in the same order. Youssef, do you want to answer? Each of you can answer whatever you like out of these questions. You don't have to answer every single question. Youssef.
Thank you, John. Maybe a few words about 1325 being the law. It's the law to some and a distant fiction to others. Particularly for those who feel it is the law and therefore very much aware of it as a normative agenda. They were lamenting the word peace from the women, peace and security agenda, that we tend to focus on women and security and the peace is not there. Peace, which is economic empowerment, women participation, for us, for entrepreneurship, for women, etc., and that there is a tendency to securitize the women and peace and security agenda, skipping the peace element. In terms of but there is a recognition, however, let me just make one more comment, by the more urban educated women that were present, that at least two women were saying how shall I put it, the normative militants among us have individualized so much 1325 away from the family and the community. And therefore, we need to strike a balance between these two parameters. Others, they've heard about 1325, but it didn't. But these women are very active in their societies in promoting this framework, extremely active, particularly the younger among them. And not just women, men as well. So you have those two nuanced attitude towards 1325. With respect to the last question, and I'll leave the others to the colleague, it's going to take us maybe another hour to address, but let me just say a few words. There are basically two attitudes toward this emerging trends to use religion to legitimize new form of governance. And there is this new entrepreneurship of fear emerging from that. And there have been two basically attitudes. One is what you have mentioned, namely, how can we create a system where religious and Islam is compatible with governance and democracy, and therefore get them to vote, include them, because these people have been the malignancy of past marginalization and exclusions. And therefore, perhaps if we opened fora for them to participate and express their views and treat each other's views as different rather than focusing on the person, maybe gradually you will address the negative aspects of it. There are others who feel that these malignancies must be combated, and therefore we must strengthen the state. And so we have seen increasingly militarization of responses. So, for example, in my country, Tunisia, extremism has become a new fight. We used to have counter-terrorism, we have counter-extremism. And we have been militarizing public security. with the predictable and unpredictable consequences you can imagine that are extremely visible with the way Boko Haram is being dealt with. So one path is to open room for their participation through the usual electoral and other processes. So if they are part of governance, that will, change. Others say it is a malignancy before it metastasizes. We need to deal with them. We need to kill terrorists. Of course, you can try. I'm not sure you can kill isms that have sort of been driving that sort of phenomena. So I'll stop here, John.
So, Mireille?
Thank you. I think I'm going to address two of the questions, building on Mr. Mahmoud's answers to 1325 and women, peace and security. There are different elements to it. Maybe to start with is to say that in ECOWAS, the 15 countries in West Africa, 12 of them have adopted national action plans for implementing 1325. That means they are aware of the women, peace and security agenda, and they want to turn it into reality. The UN Office for West Africa has established a working group on women, peace and security that bring together women from the sub-region and continue to advocate for the implementation of 1325. Also, push for their involvement in peace initiatives in the region. And they are, you mentioned specifically training, and what we were told when we were there is they are tired of training. They have received so much training in all that is governance, and that will facilitate their political participation, but also on mediation, conflict resolution. They would like to be involved. And I think they want to move beyond the training mania that is so common in countries in the region. And in terms of men's participation, maybe Warren is aware of the UN Women New campaign, He for She. Now that I'm working for UN Women, He for She tries to involve the men in supporting all these gender equality, women's empowerment agenda. And in the region, and we saw it, one of these innovative strategies that they are developing further is really to involve men. I think it's obvious that we can't achieve much, or they can't achieve much, unless the husbands, the fathers, the sons are involved and sensitized to these issues. And in Niger, when we were there, we heard about what they call École des Maris, husband schools. So at the same time that they are training, and it's implemented, I think, by UNFPA in a specific context, but at the same time that they are training women, building their capacity, and all this, they are also sensitizing the husbands, the fathers, to encourage them to send their daughters to school, to let their women participate in public fora processes, and I think they say that it has showed some results. So involving men is certainly an important element of advancing women's participation. Thank you.
Professor Benhida.
Okay, I think my answer to your question about companies, our proposition concerning the companies as a major actor in bringing stability, okay? Our proposition is related especially to African companies. Now, as you know, in Africa we have champions. And as we say in Christian, I think, tradition, help yourself and God will help you, okay? I think African companies should give the example. And this is, I think, the main sense of our proposition. So, these days in Africa, there is social innovation in banking, in agro-industry, social invention which are responding to African needs. And the second element of my answer is that the African context will encourage other companies to come and invest in Africa. As we know, Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world, after emerging Asia, and I think and equal to the Middle East. And I think where there is a risk, there is a huge profit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. If you would allow me to ask you a question, and of course I know that you're here sort of on behalf of the UN, and we're all aware that the UN is a member state organization. So given that, to what extent is this integrated strategy for the Sahel that you described aware of the need for a bottom-up strategy, interested in promoting bottom-up efforts? To some extent, what you sort of outlined here was a kind of a state-driven approach. So I wonder whether the strategy across the street really is trying to incorporate a bottom-up strategy as described by our colleagues here, or whether this is an idea that you think could now be presented to them one way or another. So maybe you could kind of illuminate a little further how the UN perceives the role of citizens, on the ground, where the UN is not the driving force.
Thank you. It's a good question. It's definitely a very important area, and it's at the heart of the strategy. The envoy recognizes the importance. We are better at talking about it than implementing. Not for any, and this is off the record.
Yeah, we're fine. You're fine.
Not for any other reason, but we're dealing with also sensitive issues that take such a long time to negotiate with governments and agree on a course of action, that by the time we have an approach that is agreed by the members of the Council and by all the countries of the region, we have that little time left to go and ensure that the inputs of the civil society are inserted. But it's definitely a weakness that we have recognized. The new special envoy has invested in hiring consultants and encouraging all sorts of forums in the region to make sure that those inputs, better late than never, are inserted now in the implementation. And I wanted to link this to the two of the questions that were asked before, regarding the need to how do we promote investments for the private sector in this hard region of the world where not many people want to invest, and what are we doing with the increasing appeal of radicalism even in moderate countries, and we have seen in trying to implement the strategy that we really need political stability, and not just within each country, but also regional cooperation in order to enable economic opportunities and investments. And those very same economic opportunities and investments are the greatest incentive against the rise of radicalism. And we are caught at the UN in situations whereby the eruption of violence and urgency in some countries do not allow us to take a long-term approach and promote regional cooperation and political stability. We go with security and military operations, and we deal with the consequence, and we don't treat the disease. And it takes so much of our attention and focus that little time and energy is left to focus on those long-term approaches that are needed for countries that are not yet in the media, but there may be soon if we don't try and promote political stability and regional cooperation. And putting the civil society inputs at the heart of this strategy is the best way to do it, because you can advocate as much as you want at the level of the UN that this is important and you should do it. But if you have your own people, your own private companies, young women and men coming through a bottom-up approach and pushing the governments to do that, it just makes the UN's job so much easier.
So I absolutely did not mean at all to put you on the spot. I simply wanted to raise a question that I think is really important here. And you also highlighted another important issue, which is, the immediate short term, tomorrow night, what do you do about Boko Haram, vis-a-vis longer term thinking, or what I like to call thinking ahead, which I ask my students, how far ahead can they think as diplomats? So we're going to have one last round here. There was a lady in the back. Warren, who was that? Huh? Why don't you get up and ask your question, and then those who have their hands up here. So 4 of you right here, very short questions, 5 of you maximum, because we're going to have one last round. Please.
Hi, my name is Yomna. I'm interning with the UN Non-Governmental Liaison Service, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the youth projects that you do, because
tell her
I
not
was
to leave
involved
and
in a
she
conference last spring that brought together youth from all over the Maghreb region. Oh, sorry. Okay, I don't want to put it too close. Okay, my name is Yomna. I'm interning with the Non-Governmental Liaison Service at the UN, and I'm interested in the youth programs or the youth initiatives that that you would envision that would help the development processes in the Maghreb region. I was recently involved in a conference last spring that brought together youth from all over the Maghreb region, and it was really effective because it was in Morocco, and for some Moroccans it was their first time meeting Algerians, and all they had known about Algeria was stuff from the news or the politics and so on. So I think it really made a difference to meet people, to meet other youth, and I think that's really important. So thank you.
Okay. Right here, the lady in the third row first, and then yours. Yeah, give her the short questions, okay? We're going to have a wrap-up session here.
I'm the vice president of an organization that has a film festival of Tuareg and Berber films that reflect the viewpoint of Berber and Tuareg filmmakers. That is, I haven't heard anything yet about the majority population of the indigenous people of that region of the Sahel, and our film festival showed great differences among all the different nations, depending on whether they were coming out of armed struggle, whether they were still involved with conflicts brought about by the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. So could you concretize some of your responses related to the indigenous population?
Yeah, how much do these approaches relate to ethnic differences that have to some extent fuel conflict?
Thank you all. My name is Salwa Kader, and I represent the U.S. Federation for Middle East Studies. I have a small comment as well as a question. I've been inviting women from Morocco since the start of their struggle for equality. I remember the first group that I had invited during CSW was 2002. And they have shared with us and spoke here. So every year after that, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they were called every name under the book by the Islamic regimes, their leaders, and what have you. And finally, there was a shift how they start fighting for their rights by using the Sharia law in order to get their rights. And it worked. So the last year when they came, I remember that they all told me that the king bought all their tickets and sent them off here, which we were happy. Why is this not used again and again towards talking with the religious leaders? Thank you.
Great. Madame.
Thank you very much. I also want to just acknowledge the speakers for very interesting presentations. My name is Josephine Jambo, former ambassador in DPR Kenya, now working with UNFPA. And Mireille has spoken about the work we're doing at UNFPA with the men's groups and involving men. I'm transitioning to the Commonwealth Secretariat in the position of Deputy Secretary General, Political Affairs. So this is very interesting discussion. I have two quick questions. One, on the issue of political participation, because that's the second part of today's theme. The political space is a little bit different from the national public space. And we do know that, indeed, democracy is developing in Northern Africa and in the Sahel generally. But I haven't really heard anything about interventions to improve political engagement of young people and women from the presentations. You've spoken a lot about public policy, but I wonder about public policy that would influence political party manifestos, constitutions, affirming young people into politics, supporting them through electoral processes and cycles. I haven't heard about that yet. And then I'd like to ask if you have baseline data that would tell us about what's happening. Are we really having more women in there, and at what levels, and more young people, and where are they? Thank you.
Great. So the next to the last here, and then the gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Taima Murford from the International Rescue Committee. I would like to hear more about how the political participation is being broken down for youth into young men and young women. Because I think we heard in one of the presentations that youth representation doesn't always, or in fact very rarely, means young women's representation. And so what is happening in the different interventions, in the strategy, in the research, and the different pieces of work around really honing in on that piece of young women's political participation? Thank you.
Great. And the gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Pratik Awasthi, also with the United Nations Population Fund. I think there's a common theme running through these questions, and it is about young people. To add the point that in the Sahel in particular, you have countries like Mali, Mauritania, where half the population is below the age of 17. So they're very young countries we're looking at. It's slightly higher up in the Maghreb, up to about 25, but still you have the median age of 25 in many of the countries there. If there is any likelihood of sustainable peace, it's going to be with the participation of young people in it. So I want to invite all of you to share your experiences on what that has been like.
Well, these are extremely good questions. So the panel is going to give everybody here sort of a brief response. And then if those of you would all remain till we wrap this up, and then they can meet with you individually later on to give you more information. So we'll stay in the same order here. And Youssef, why don't you go first?
Maybe I'll take this last questions about participation, particularly of the young, and my colleagues who have been in the field can further elaborate, but I certainly will share with you my observation from my own country and from what I heard from the young people. Young people have almost a visceral distaste for organized politics, and they are voting less and less. And it does not mean that they don't want to participate, but they are inventing new ways of being involved and being counterpowers. For example, in my country, women bloggers and rappers, if you believe it, are in the forefront of how to organize differently and how leadership is exercised at the grassroots level, and how they are promoting leadership not vertically, but among networks and movements and horizontally. And the example of Burkina Faso, of this young, very energetic rapper who is one of the leaders, and Y'en a marre in Senegal are the most obvious and publicized movements of how young people and young women, both young women, are organizing themselves to ensure that the transition is not shaped without them or at times against them. So they are inventing, and art is another form how they are. So political participation is not necessarily. Some of them obviously are realizing that in order to affect politics, they have to organize themselves politically. So some political parties have, or some young people have come with a new, and they are struggling uphill because it needs organization, it needs money, it needs, but they feel that they can affect change differently rather than being co-opted by elders and oath just to have them vote and then they forget about them. So there is this tension. But they feel they can mobilize themselves differently. And the latest elections in my country, eloquently demonstrates this lack. They didn't vote. Very few of them did. One more point about the Sharia law and your question. This is almost has become not an exception. It's amazing how these strategies have been duplicated in many countries, from Pakistan to Libya to Morocco, and I leave my friend and Professor Bushra to elaborate on that. I can share with you Libya, for example, and I'd be happy to share with you some YouTubes and see how of how to promote 1325 and gender equality as an Islamic function. It is not sort of an exogenous, universal, Western imposed upon. And so these young women, particularly, have found ways in interpreting certain verses of the Quran to affirm that equality is good for Islam, is good for women, is good for the family, is good for men, is good for society. And they took that interpretation and they went to the imams who are recognized authorities, but not the radical ones, and they basically certified in writing that this is a right interpretation. And they used that as a way of promoting the values and the principle enshrined in the normative. And they have films and they have verses of how they, and it is read by women, and they teach, speaking of, they teach women Sharia exegesis, experts. So it is not just the men who have the better interpretation, and it is taking place, the same thing in Pakistan, to radicalize young people who have been, radicalization anonymous, as they call it, using precisely a different interpretation of that. Morocco has done a wonderful initiative, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, where the king, following his visit to the Sahel, almost started Madrasa Anonymous, or Madrasa Without Borders, which is basically bringing the imams to a specific interpretation, Islam as a way of living, as a way of governing, and to train them in this modern, proactive, pro-peace kind of interpretation of Islam. And 500 Malians or some such number is already in Rabat, Tunisia, is going to take advantage of that school to send its own imams. And so there is almost a movement, I would say, both addressing to women as agents of change, armed with this knowledgeable interpretation of the precept of religion. So it's not the sole preserve of certain experts or certain men.
Mireille.
Thank you. I'm going to address 3 questions. And the first one, very briefly, to add on to Mr. Mahmoud's answers and concerning religious leaders. And this we were told during the visit by the women that we met, but we also had a meeting here at IPI with a cleric from Mali who reiterated what we heard throughout the visits. It's the fact that we hear so much about the very conservative ones, while a larger space needs to be really provided to the tolerant, the progressive voices of Islam, because these voices are certainly there, but like no one really hear them because the other ones are so much more louder. And I think they really ask for larger platforms for progressive or moderate clerics. In terms of strategies to increase young political leaders' participation, we also heard a number of suggestions. First, in all 3 countries, I think we were interested in listening to them and saying that, yes, they may be involved by belonging or belonging to a political party, but some of them also actually prefer to be involved at their community level, supporting community initiatives, and they also think it's political participation. And like they criticize the government, they point to the things that are maybe not totally right, but they don't want to be involved. For them, for those who want to be involved, I think they also shared a number of ideas that could be used. First, they definitely don't want or want to get rid of this limitation. Like there are age limits in terms of political participation for running for elections, either at parliamentarian or like at presidential levels. I think some youth are not that comfortable with that. Another element that they say within political parties is the existence of these commissions, and it's not only for the youth; it's also like the Women Commission, the Youth Commission, And they just want to be part of the mainstream, like political party functioning, debates, discussions. And they think that the existence of these commissions actually limit their participation. And the other element that both youth and women told us to increase youth participation is also to learn from the women's movement. And they said, yes, women have quota, but youth don't have any quota for their political participation. So the idea of quota for youth or to increase youth political participation was also mentioned. The presentation that I did is very, very brief. I think the report probably certainly addresses some of these strategies, and it will be interesting to read it when it comes out. The last point I wanted to touch on is the participation of young women political leaders. What we saw, and we also heard it, it's the fact that when women are either at school, university, when they are not married yet and not like busy with their family responsibilities, they are able to get involved. But as soon as they are or they get married, they have families, they have children, it's very difficult either for them like to leave their families and go. In Mali, Niger, and Senegal, the three countries, they told us that important political meetings happen late at night, and no man or husband would like his wife to attend these meetings. That ends at very late hours. And we were also told that in some cases, it's when women have actually left these late hour meetings that the real decisions are being made. Political or electoral lists are being prepared or rewritten. And women don't have access to these revised lists. So it is an issue, and I think probably ideas need to be thought about supporting women who have these responsibilities, family responsibilities, to allow them to also get involved into politics. Thanks.
Great. Professor Benhida.
Okay, concerning the question about indigenous, I'm gonna give an answer based on Moroccan experience. I'm proud to come from a country which is the only country which the constitutions recognize Amazigh, which is language of minority, which is recognized Jewish, because Jewish people is indigenous Moroccan. Excuse me, correct me if I... Jewish people are indigenous community, Morocco. And the Moroccan constitution is the only constitution, I think, in the Arab world which is recognized Jewish as citizenship. Okay? I think in Morocco, we recognize the rights of my indigenous through art, through education, and through language recognition. So about the question, to make a link, I think, between Islam, Sharia, and I'm gonna give you an example. I took a part to a book on geopolitics of women conditions. And I'll give you a simple example. Men take advantage of Arabian complex grammar. C'est correct. La grammaire complexe. Okay? Because, we have word, qiwama, Arab qiwama. This word has 30 significations.
Meanings.
Yeah, meanings. And one of these 30 meanings is authority, and men choose authority. And the other meanings are assistance, assist women, support women, and they profit or take advantage of this complexity of grammar. And to just one word about how to have youth more engaged in, bottom-up strategy is, I think, the relevant solution. Why? Because, in Morocco, a few years ago, we experienced we experience it because it's ongoing, development. In Morocco, each community make citizenship and civil society. By the way, in Morocco, there are laws which are defend interests of civil society. I think we are the first in the Arab world too. And we in each community, not commune, district, work on territorial diagnosis. Its own territorial diagnosis to know its weaknesses, strengths, and after that they put territorial marketing. Because generally we sum up democracy in transparency during the elections, and democracy, it isn't the only meaning of democracy. I think democracy is to give population to choose their future, and to be engaged in building their future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you. I think this is fascinating. We need to do a linguistic study to help implement the UN strategy more effectively. Just a very brief answer on a question that was asked on whether we have, how far advanced we are in having statistics and databases and quotas. And we have a working group on governance based in Dakar struggling with these questions and trying to implement the strategy. And every few months they send us different statistics and figures based on how they define the Sahel and which countries they include in the definition. And we have noticed that it's really just the first step. It's like the minimum that anyone can do. It can't solve anything. And in many of the countries where the Sahel strategy is being implemented, it ends up being a checklist and not really on their own. They don't ensure meaningful participation, and only by again promoting regional cooperation, ensuring that you have an enabling economy that allows opportunity and people to express themselves. It's through long-term measures like education for young boys and girls that will eventually ensure meaningful participation of women and men. Those baselines are really just the very, very first step.
So there's a lot of knowledge and experience up here on this panel, and I think I can say on behalf of everybody in the room that we're really very grateful to all of you and to you for coming from Morocco to be with us. And I want to thank all of you who asked questions too. So a big round of applause for the panel here.